The Traveller. "Walk with me," Leaf said. Taking Torunn's hand, he led her into the orchard. As they walked, he told her the story of his birth, his childhood, education, and companions. He would tell her of his travels, of the castle and the hall, and of her father. She saw the story projected in the trees and leaves of the wood. Wherever she looked, she saw her life, and that of her children, her own birth, a flash of light amidst mountains. She saw her mother, her cottage, the hills and the sea, her brother and her horse, a shepherd, his boy, and their sheep. She saw herself and her husband. Cats prowled between the trees amidst jungles of ferns, watching, waiting for the arrival of swans. The rhythm of his voice was steady like waves, touching, overlapping the slow, ever-present sound of the spring. He told the story his father created. Light filled me, but I saw nothing. I tried to speak, but had no words. I tried moving, but was exhausted, and so I dreamed. From wide wings my shadow swept over hills, a twig on the breeze-rippled surface of water. An old man appeared, seated, enthroned on a cloud, floating before me. He told me, "This is your day." But all I could do was watch, knowing my destination, never my course. By the light of sun and moon I saw fields, plants and trees, patterns of sleek bodies, birds in formation. My life began with that dream, a newborn child of earth and sky, my mother's child brought forth to serve my father's will. For 2 years I lay atop that mountain above cloud, my parents' wide wedding bed spread beneath. Sky gave me emptiness to see without knowledge, to know space, so to learn its will of matter. So I lay watching, but no grass tickled my sides, birds never reached my summit, animals never ventured so high. My food and drink were sunlight and snow, stone and sky, gusts of wind like herds of horses. I was nurtured this way, no warm hand to hold me, no soft flesh to rest me upon my bed of bone. I knew no voice but the wind, no warmth but sun, no breath but emptiness of air. Around that rocky perch, snow garmented all in white, all but me, my small form waiting for nothing. 24 circles of moon passed before I stood, my form now a boy, my bones of living stone now firm. My hair from the sun was given his gold to surge and tumble a running mane of wind. My eyes from the moon were given her silver, and the blue of the sky, light to pierce darkness. Storms descended, blinding driven snow, encrusting ice to freeze my body and mind. But young muscles grew against the force of wind as it pushed and I countered, as it turned and I dodged. Against limits I strained, my father my adversary, my mother my cold support. Never did my voice emit, never my eyes did close. Always naked, I learned clarity through storm. 5 years more I remained, standing in the wind, naked atop stone, until a youth with the strength of a man, the balance of windswept trees. 7 years alone I was, with stone and snow beneath, sweeping cloud and the sun and moon above. A speck of flesh upon hardness, no roots but gripping toes, nothing amid space. After 7 years, finally, a silent bird in silhouette, its movements slow, its wings still. It appeared in the distance, small and black, until closer it came, and faster it moved, turning with feathers outstretched. Brown, flecked black and gold, in 7 great arcs coasted, encircling the rock high above the wide white cloud skirt below. The bird lifted me in talons, effortlessly. For 3 days and nights it held me beneath. I was not afraid of this unknown creature, a creation of sky, strong and warm above me. The ground rose and fell, white snow and grey stone. Mountains rose like warmed air, fire peaks against the darkening sky. Unmoving rivers of rock-strewn ice gouged solid stone, and beneath the snowy ridges the ice became water, and for the first time I saw green. We descended and alit upon a rocky outcrop on a mountain wall, high above a valley. The bird landed beside me, Its wings stretched and then folded against its sides. I looked down and saw a lake and a large structure of stone rising from the rocky shore. When I turned back, the bird was gone. An old man stood where it had been. He was dressed in long black robe, but his feet were bare, his hair white as snow. His eyes reflected the moon, and in his hand he held a staff almost twice my height of wood. He looked down at me in silence. The old man gestured towards the valley below, and then I heard his voice, the voice from my dream. The monastery below will be your home. In your 7 years you have known no seasons but winter, with its shifting snows, its slow passage of ice. Know now that in your single 7-year season, 70 winters here have passed. Now you shall learn the cycle of life, the seasons of birth, maturity, and death. You shall see how creation arises, how it thrives and succumbs as gusts over meadows. You have taken man's form and shall learn how he ages like the plants and animals of the earth. In your one long wintry season, you have become a boy, while a man has lived and died. So to serve me, those with you shall have years to match your own. Some shall be your masters, others, 12 companion pairs, your comfort, are to serve you in your work. When you and your companions have grown, I shall return, and you shall ride with me to complete your training. Torunn listened as if she dreamed, entranced within the orchard's fragrance and by his voice. The sun set and stars appeared. The moon rose, casting all into silver until the sun appeared again to recast color. They walked. Torunn was reminded of when she was a girl, sitting in the house of her mother's friends, from whom she received her horse and her books. They had taught her to read, through fairy tales, stories of magical beings that lived in streams, flowers, and the blossoms of trees. They had opened her mind to seeing more than could be seen by the eyes. She saw the beauty of the world, the lives of the trees and creatures of the forest and field. But her husband's story, though containing magic, was different. It was austere. In her life the coldness was softened by warmth, but in his, so far, there had been none. The traveller's voice continued. The bird appeared and swept me again to the sky. Casting downwards, we landed before doors of wood. We entered the great stone hall. Monks, clothed in black, sat still as stone. 12 boys and 12 girls on rough rugs also sat unmoving. The old man strode forward. I followed, and we turned to face the seated figures. Then he spoke. Masters, here is your charge. Train him in the ways I have taught you. When I come for him, he must be prepared, ready to complete his training. Children, guard this boy as your life. Follow his charge. Be his armor. 2 monks, each with eyes made of sky, rose and approached. The first carried clothes. A belt woven from cord lay atop a hooded robe of grey wool to match those of the monks and children. The second bore weapons, a 4-foot staff of oak, a short sword, and a knife. I learned then the passage of years. The seasons came and went. No more did I know but of winter. 100 summers passed. Our minds held lifetimes spent in the study of ourselves, nature, and the fighting arts. We slept and sat together, at rest, in meditation, at meals. We ran the length of valleys, climbed the mountain walls. We found the springs that transform ice into rising cloud. We learned the singular way of birth and death. Our grey masters trained us in quiet listening, right speech, and the growing of food, the making and use of paper, brush, and ink. But we also learned to cultivate fragrance along the valley floor, and by that we crafted the greatest treasure of the valley. On mountain walls, great hives produced nectar richer than gold. We learned from our masters to store the nectar in the cool, dry stillness of caves. We learned respect for sky and earth, for each other, that we should never stray from our task to serve. Before dawn, with chiming bell, we rose and sat within the hall, in formation to witness the quiet of minds. As the first light gleamed through east windows, we greeted the day, sat by streams, on rock and beneath tree, to witness the awakening life. Light fell across the clinging dew of morning leaves and flowers. It warmed our bodies, penetrated night-cold flesh and bone. We understood our duty to protect the sky and earth, our temple, and so we learned the fighting arts to reflect the conflict in nature. Naked, unarmed, we fought to learn the strength and weakness of limbs, the weight of weapons, until we moved as our thoughts. We learned our limits and we learned loyalty and trust, but only for the temple and its defenders. The monks kept dogs, horses, and the blackest of birds, and we learned them as we knew each other, as fellows and companions. We learned their communication, one to another, and how to convey by look and by sound our wishes, simple and subtle. We learned to hunt with the eyes of birds, the scent of hounds, the speed of horses. We learned to act as one, a collective body of limbs moving in accordance with the will of a single mind. 12 pairs plus one, together to hear the rise and fall of the sun and the passing of stars. At our master's instruction, we wrote of the nature of life, of the constancy of ever-changing matter. We recognized patterns in nature, the embodiment of infinite space within the coursing stream, within the wind-ruffled feathers of birds. We saw those patterns in the bark of the trees, in our own changing forms, in our mother's shifting bone. We saw pattern in golden hair and in moonlit silver eyes, reflecting sparks of fire rising to the sky. Under their instruction, we came to resemble our masters as anonymous silent shadows, still as stone. As I had known only space and the movement of wind, my companions had been with the monks since birth. As a son of sky and earth, I surpassed in skill and knowledge. By my roots, planted in the deep abstract of all, I understood. And then my masters returned me with my companions to my father to be trained as masters ourselves. All now young men and women, we had lived 170 winters, 170 springs. Each season was steeped in meditation, in the study of nature. We, a single mind with 24 limbs and the senses of beast and bird. We lived to serve a master, our hardly known father, and his mistress upon whose bosom we grew. The old man had returned, and in the presence of the monks we gathered in the hall to sit, now ourselves as statues. Breezes whispered through the orchard's leaves, and still the couple walked. Outside in the world, winter in white robes set her crystalline glance about and sang her lullaby, succumbing nature to sleep. But in the orchard summer arrived, fruit emerged to replace spring buds. In the woodland around the pool, butterflies flittered between the trees. Small birds and other creatures, those of the ground, like the butterflies absent before, emerged in pairs. They took no fright at the movement of the figures between the trees. Torunn, throughout her life, had noticed animals were less alarmed by her presence and by the presence of others. She had watched how animals responded to each other and to men. Never hunted birds, deer and squirrel, were unworried by each other, and yet men caused them to hide. The animals realized the threat inherent in men to their world. They sensed its destructive nature, its incompatibility with the quiet life they lived. There were also threats from wolves and from wildcats, but these were limited. They fit into the world in a way that man never would. Exacerbating the relationship between man and nature was man's own view that nature was something to be tamed, something to be brought under his control. This, she had often felt, reflected the self-indulgence of man's pride. Man's world and her small experience of it never matched the beauty and harmony that she had seen in nature. Man's way was more of waste and ugliness. It defiled a certain purity in a way that animals never could. But she questioned her idea of purity, whether she really could place nature with all of the conflict it itself entailed above man's ways. Growing amongst country people who lived directly from the land, she was steeped in that perspective. To them, nature was a world of threats. It was a world in which a man could perish of cold or be haunted with fear of the creaking shadows of trees in the night or the howling of unseen wolves. But in time, the perspective she gained from living amongst men succumbed to the sheer beauty of nature. All the warmth she had witnessed, all the loyalty and commitment of parents to their children to feed and keep warm, to survive, was eclipsed by the insistent balance she witnessed in man's absence. It was for that reason she had chosen nature over man. Nature had proved that the argument for man, as he was, as she had witnessed him, simply could not sustain itself. Man did not cause sunlight to gleam through trees to streams. Man did not cause buds to emerge from sleeping branches, nor leaves of the brightest translucent green to appear and transform into richest yellows, oranges, reds, and purples. Man did not create the petals of flowers that rose from the soil to meet the sun, nor the shimmering coats of animals, the iridescent wings of insects, the infinite structures of snowflakes, the twinkling of stars. She had not seen man's best efforts, only pictures, imitations in pigment of structures of stone. But neither had she seen until now nature's most remarkable achievements. She had not seen the snow mountains of the east, the ice tundra of the north, the inland sea deserts of the south, nor the great rain forests of the west. The world she had known was small. It was of hills and not of mountains, of smaller trees, though thick of girth. The rivers she had known were but trickling streams compared to the miles-wide continental drains that she had read of in her books as existing in foreign lands. And yet, merely by that world of small sounds and simple creatures, even before she had arrived in the Valley of the Springs, she had seen that no stone structure of man could compare to the peaceful hills and valleys of her childhood, that no wooden structure of man could compare to the quiet woods through which she had ridden on Mikkel. She could not ignore that no portrait could do justice to the complexity of a man's true face, nor convey the deep and shifting emotion of a woman. She could not ignore that no painted landscape could convey the infinite living detail of what inspired it. In her quiet world of wind upon moors and small waves upon shores, she had seen the same infinite beauty she would have seen anywhere on the earth. It was all that was required for her to question the fundamental self-centered outlook of man. This valley, this orchard, this pool, and the man who walked beside her confirmed her instinct. Man sheltered from truth to protect one small but powerful facet of himself. Torunn did not know what that aspect was, but she sensed it, she saw the results of it, and it had led her to see man as animals do, with distrust and concern. But Torunn had seen a better side of man within the town where her mother had died. There man lived in a state of greater harmony with himself and with nature. The balance was in the water, and it fed the inhabitants who bathed in it. It had intrigued her to see the difference between that world and the world of her village. Those of her village were, in a way, much closer to nature. It was, after all, just a small collection of dwellings surrounded on all sides by fields and hills. They were farmers who lived by growing their food, by raising animals on the land, and yet there the people took no joy in the beauty that surrounded them. They lived amidst it, interacted with nature every day, yet the beauty of that nature, more often than not, eluded them. In Riverton it had been different. The people rejoiced in the beauty of nature. They had their intrinsically human world, their creations, their trade and conversation, all of which was foreign to the world of beasts. And yet everything they did was both consciously and unconsciously inspired by the river, by sunlight, by the moon and stars, the fields and hills, the birds and beasts. Those of Riverton were more human than those of her village, and yet they were also more of nature. To Torunn, to the best of her comprehension of her own experience, this had meant that to be human was to be a part of nature, not outside it. It was to embrace it and nurture it by respecting the beauty it held. She realized that the humanity she had known, until then, was one that lived apart from nature, although within it. It was one that feared nature, which saw only nature's threats and not its beauty. But the town was unusual, and Torunn knew that man elsewhere had miscomprehended what it was to be human. Still she and Leaf walked, slowly through the wood, watching birds collecting for their nests, preparing for their young. Torunn wondered if this was the way it always was here in the valley, if each year pairs arrived at the pool to perpetuate their kind. Her husband's story continued. Two masters entered from an open door, approached a table at the head of the hall. One carried upon a tray of beaten gold a ceramic jar covered and sealed. Beneath the great window on the table he placed the tray and its heavy burden. He removed the lid from the jar, released the light of the sun. The second master approached. On a tray of beaten silver was a cup of fine white stone. He placed it at the center of the table. The cup was carved from base to lip with diverse beasts of nature and intertwining forms of plant and tree. From a pouch at his belt, the old man drew a spearhead of translucent white that glimmered softly in the light. With stout cord he fastened the head to his staff, and with its edge cut his palm. 25 drops from the wound fell to wet the goblet's basin. As the last drop fell, the wound healed. He motioned to the first master, and 25 drops of the monk's blood fell to mingle with the old man's. His wound healed. The master stepped back. The old man motioned to the second, who did as had been done before. Another 25 drops fell. The two monks bowed, then lifted the goblet from the table and turned to face one another, holding the goblet between them. The old man held the spear, while the remaining monks rose from their seats to do as their fellows had done. Only then did we, the 25, rise. Each gave blood as had the masters, but we remained standing, I in front, my companions behind. The two standing masters placed the goblet at the center of the table and took between them the ceramic jar. Lifting it together, they poured a stream of liquid, gold and bright as the sun, to fill the goblet of stone. When they stepped back, a beam of light from the north-facing rose window above fell upon the cup, 12 slow beats of masters' hearts. The masters from all points of the hall called in echoing unison for me to approach. As I arrived, the light retreated. The two masters lifted the goblet and tilted it so that I could drink. Evening sunlight bathed my face, imprinted in beaten gold, lining the cup where infinite leaves had flickered as if aflame. Ruby and gold, molten, thick and heavy, the liquid moved slowly towards my lips. I drank enough to empty that basin many times, yet when I drew my lips away, still it was full. I returned to my position in the hall, and my companions drank as I had. Then we sat. The hall cleared. We were left alone. We closed our eyes and felt our bodies recede. In space, amorphous forms touched and shed a light of sound. In concert, our spirits sang a steady hum to vibrate the building blocks of matter with the energy that gives form to life. I opened my eyes and stepped from my body. Alongside, my companions had done likewise. We each looked down on our bodies, now of stone, suspended in space, infused with sound. Above me, the towering walls of the hall reached to an open sky from which the light of stars fell upon us, while the moon from behind a mountain rose. By the moon's light I watched stone columns become giant trunks of trees, wound with ivy, with roots that spread across the floor. Those roots grew up beneath me, formed a seat that lifted me to where I could see myself and my companions around me. 24 stones that rose twice the height of a man bordered all within the mountain forest's clearing. Before the tall stones in the space around the altar stood forth from their sleeping forms the naked spirits of my companions. Encircling my sleeping body with effervescent light, their silver hair fell over shoulders like water. They were each equivalent in every way. They had shared their lives, learning and experiences. They were protective and powerful, gracefully wild, composed by an intellect to achieve an ideal of life. In unison, each woman looked to the man at her left, and for the first time they formed couples. Astrida, divine beauty, joined Torfrider, thunder's peace. Unner, love, joined Tormodr, thunder's mind. Kelda, fountain, joined Tortrigger, thunder's trust. Air, mercy, joined Torstein, thunder's stone. Lifa, life, joined Torvalder, thunder's rule. Hydron, honor lord, joined Torkettle, thunder's cauldron. Ula, sea jewel, joined Torarin, thunder's eagle. Alfhildr, elf battle, joined Torgunr, thunder's war. Vigdis, battle spirit, joined Torberger, thunder's protector. Hjordis, sword spirit, joined Torbrander, thunder's sword. Hilfdis, shield spirit, joined Torgeir, thunder's spear. And Borghildr, castle battle, joined Torgeisel, thunder's arrow. Seated, I looked at Borghildr's spirit. Tall, beautiful and strong, a warrior to her core, sleek as a beast, graceful and quiet as water. Her skin, lit by stars, was pale and smooth. Her eyes, bright as spearheads in the moon. Her strength spoke of speed, but her face was calm, without emotion. An expression without joy, without sorrow, an expression of acceptance without need to question. Borghilda, like the others, proceeded slowly but certainly, each step measured, every moving angle of limb directed. She looked down at Torgeisel's sleeping form, his eyes closed, his body alive, quiet and serene, awaiting her. She lowered herself beside him, ran her fingers along his leg, tracing the muscles, brushing his rising phallus with the back of her hand. Slowly skimming her touch over his firm belly, her hands found his chest. Her back arched, her breasts rose, her hips lifted. She positioned herself and reached beneath to guide him. She took him, his body flexed. She gripped at his chest, her abdomen controlling, anchored by shoulders and arms, veins responding to force. She continued with the strength of one who can run, one who can swim, one who may live without sleep at will. Her body was as strong as her mind as focused as her spirit. She lived in a space of necessity. Beside them, Hjordis lay to invite Torbrander's spirit, floating above her, moving closer, exploring her with fingers and tongue. As she moved, responded in her dream to his lips upon her breasts, pulling at her nipples, grasping her gently with his teeth. Her back rose, curved, but his power was firm, and caress turned to grip muscle to shift her limbs with his will. Her legs opened, requesting him, closing again for the pressure, anticipating his grip that moved along her thigh. She caught it between her legs, released it, allowed it to rise, aching, yielding, wishing for more. She grasped his hand, pressed it against her. Her grasp tightened, then relaxed, and he planted his hands at her sides, kissed her eyes, and entered her. Her body shivered and writhed. Her eyes, like Torgeisel's beside her, were closed, but her body was active. She held his waist, drew him to her, clawed, gripped at his torso, pulling him, biting at his shoulder. His movement had slowed, but then with increasing power he took her, lifting her hips to him, drawing her body, carrying her on his lap. Kissing him, her fingers laced into his hair, she drew his head, his lips to her chest, to her neck, groped at his shoulders, pressed against his shining form. A kinetic energy now ruled. Torbrander's spirit had her as though she were weightless. With the power of dream, the power to meet her, fulfill and respect her, satisfy what she craved, he within gave himself to her. I looked around the circle. 24 sleeping forms had invited 24 awakened spirits. My body, meanwhile, lay upon the altar, as still as I, my spirit, upon the chair. Over time, the speed of the rhythm increased. It had begun with affection and care, the slow, quiet movements of the spirits attending to the bodies, stroking, breathing, loving. But over time, each couple had, like Torbrander and Hjordis, broken free into a more intense dynamic. Then it proved impossible to determine spirit from body, couple from couple. An ordered chaos had taken hold, boundaries between became blurred, contact expanded to all within reach. The companions had become a weave of translucent fibers, perpetually moving, reaching, touching, a fluid ring of shifting celestial brightness. My companions had become one, each an element, speeding, slowing, exploring, gripping, joining, releasing, climbing, together, complete. Then, with the lowering of the moon, all became still, and all fell silent. The women had taken from the men the seed of their lives, and with this done all rose from sleeping forms. My sisters stood before me, each held a crystal orb containing a tiny flickering light. They turned and set the orbs into small depressions that encircled my body. With their presence a shift occurred. My skin, no longer smooth, became rough. Its surface now carried tiny crystals of diverse colors of textured light. It was as if my body had been rolled in a bed of gemstones, as if every pore had given birth to a single shimmering droplet of color. The light fed the 12 encircling orbs, which brightened until each became itself a source of silver light, each a silvery moon. I stepped down from my seat and approached my sleeping form. Still encrusted, it looked like a bed of embers in the night. The light flickered and shifted, glimmering in the breeze, iridescent in the moving night air. In time, the orbs dimmed to a subtle glow that emanated steadily, fueled from within. They were formed in a vacuum, crystallized into simple spheres containing space and clarity. Stars shone in the blackness above. Branches retreated into the vaults of a ceiling that rested not on the swaying trunks of trees, but once again on firm columns of stone. My body and I became one, and I awoke to a view of sparkling colors, a great hall enveloped by light, a million panes of colored glass. I sensed movement, the entrance of the masters. I felt the floor, the ceiling, and the walls. We had returned. My eyes opened and I stood. As I did, so too did my companions, each woman carrying a small orb of light. The old man stood behind the altar. He motioned to my companions and to the masters before looking at me. The women filed forward. Each was met by a master who took each crystal orb, then stood to the side. The old man motioned to the orb bearers, and they moved forward, heads bowed, steps slow. They placed the orbs on small platforms carved into the wall behind the altar, and there for many years they would rest, gently emanating their steady light. The masters filed from the hall. All that remained was myself, my companions, and the old man who silently looked upon us. We waited. After some minutes the masters returned. They stood on either side of the altar, bearing not orbs but weapons. My companions moved forward one by one to receive a longsword, a tall spear, and a bow with a quiver of arrows. Along the curving blade of the long sword were lightly etched images of vine that stretched and reached from tang to point. We moved our short swords to our belts and slung our long swords across our backs. The spears were 6 feet long of oak, and their heads from pouches attached with cord. Like the old man's, our spearheads were of crystal, but black. Like his, ours were sharp as swords and hard enough to thrust through stone. The bows were of ash, sturdy, 3 feet in length unstrung, crafted to allow the range of any longer bow. They could shower or snipe, from a distance or from horse, or silently and swiftly in the tightest quarters. The quivers of leather carried 100 black feathered arrows, precise in their fury, each true to its course. My companions received these with honor, each bowing and returning to his place, newly armed and prepared for a new training, the final phase. It was my turn, and the masters retreated. As I approached, the old man stood alone. Upon the table were weapons made to complement my own. Each were like those of my companions, but each also differed. My sword, rather than black at the grip, was of the blue of the night. The blade likewise was tinged with blue, as though made of steel forged in the sky. Along its side ran a pattern of leaf and the inscription in hidden letters. This sword, by sky given, is rooted in earth, all to be one, one with mind of all. My oaken staff was also different, with a head of the translucent blue of a mountain lake, one untouched by organic matter, a lake of stone, of mineral reflecting sky alone. My arrows were feathered in the same deep blue of night. Their heads were of the same crystal as a spear, with strength to pierce. The masters presented us with clothes. In our years we had known none but our robes. Now we received riding clothes, trousers, shirts, belts, boots, and jerkins. We received jackets, heavy riding cloaks, and new robes, all of dark grey wool. From the stables to each was given one black horse, with saddle, bags, and a blanket of wool. My horse was Melior, son of Kirin. He was beautiful and proud, with broad feather-fringed hooves to hammer the ground. Also allotted from the kennels to each of 12, a dog as guide and sentry, strong, lithe, and black. One dog was for myself alone. He was called Leolfer, my shield, my senses in darkest night. And so our group had enlarged, and arrayed to depart, 63 robed in black. Images passed through Torunn's thought. The dog and the horse, the wool, swords, names. She remembered the black horse that grazed the meadow as she arrived. She remembered the black dog that met her and led her to the valley, and those from her past that visited with the shepherd and his boy, and that of the couple she knew with her mother. She remembered the sheep and the shepherd's gifts, but she knew nothing of swords and spears. She thought of the names. Her memory of them seemed clouded. The men had names like her own, but there was something else. Neither Torunn nor Leaf were clothed as they walked. It was warm both at night and by day. She felt the sun and breeze on her skin, the comfortable coolness of starlight. Her body was changing. Her belly and breasts swelled as though to mirror the still ripening fruit of the trees. She felt calm. The images of her husband's story still moved through her. Time passed with his words, and she came to know him through his eyes, his touch, and her sense of his presence. His story was unlike any other. It had not appeared in her books, and yet it seemed familiar, as if it filled an empty space within her she had not realized was there. His story continued. Now with but one master to follow, the spear master, the father of war, on light-hoofed Kirin, the fire-breather. 2 mothers perched on his shoulders, Ashild, divine battle, and Asfred, divine peace. From them the all-seeing ravens flew, to ever watch the world of man. Alongside him were 2 wolves the size of lions, Asan, divine harvester, and Aseva, divine life. By horse we set forth, with 13 untiring sentry dogs, long of leg, deep of chest, always moving, before, alongside, and behind. The old man led us north and west, and for weeks we travelled through and over mountains. Our green valley gave way to high passes of stone and snow, to traverse between barren peaks and icy hanging lakes. Then meadows with their flowers, gushing streams, their soft warm soil. From the mountains we descended to a high plateau, an empty wilderness where hardly a creature stirred. We followed a seemingly never-ending path across a nothingness of stony ground, bolstered by nothing but the now distant mountains behind. In the open ground, the dogs' range of movement increased to expand our knowledge of the world through which we passed. By their exploration, senses reached beyond the horizons of eyes, but never did they in their spread lose our silent movement. That plain gave way to a land of grass, where shallow meandering rivers, bedded on stone, washed away shallow roots to shift an ever-changing land. Upon the wide grass we gave rein. The horses strove long necks forward, increased their stride, their manes and tails streaming. At the fords between river curves, amidst a spray of airborne droplets, the horses leaped, never hindered through the water. We rode as a tight diamond of horse, surging within the perpetually expanding and contracting formation of our centuries. The sky was as large as the ground was wide. It spread high and clear as a great dome of blue. Long streaks of cloud reached to the horizon to form wisps of pink in the evening light. The ground descended, and before us we saw a land of hill and forest. It was there we turned north by northwest. Our guide avoided settlements, and always we kept moving, that those we saw would never wonder for long at the sight of unknown warriors. But settlements were few and people fewer. Isolated farms evinced evidence of life, but the towns we skirted were empty, with desolate lanes bordered by silent houses. The people we saw seemed strange to my companions and I, who had known but ourselves and our silent masters. We glimpsed men and women lacking in stature and grace, their faces and bodies dirty and toiling. But we never paused, allowing only ever a sideways glance from galloping steeds. To the north we rode and entered a familiar land of snow and forest, and eventually of high mountains. Into the mountains we rode, higher and higher, our horses' breath again appearing as hot, icy mist in the fresh, still air. We rode to a forgotten place, a hidden, fertile valley with a grove of towering trees walled by sheer cliffs. It was our new home, and there our journey ended. We dismounted and gave our horses their freedom. This was what Torunn had not seen but imagined. Worlds of mountains, plains, and high plateaus, and his voice as he told her of the open spaces where the land was as wide and high as the sky, aroused an awe in her that could never have been evinced from the pages of a book. Never had we seen trees of such size. Red-fleshed trunks rose like spires from the ferny ground filling the valley. Hidden by high branches were caves in the cliffs, supported by columns found in stone. Ladders of branch led to the canopy where a maze of ropes gave access to the caves. In those caves our study continued until we, under the tutelage of our master's teacher, became masters ourselves. Our silence increased under the eyes of cloud and wind, and with minds focused on beauty, our skill in combat grew. But we also learned about man, and to understand his mind, to master his knowledge, we met the librarian. In simple, beautiful books of smooth paper bound in leather, the librarian had collected a treasury of works. The books were monuments to man's greatest minds, not only those remembered, but those forgotten, lost, or unknown. Ever since man's first use of a tool, the librarian had watched. He had seen what man had created, and also what man had destroyed. The books held what he wished to save, and now he had been commanded to attend to us, to give us access to his choices. We studied the complex and the simple, man's needs and wants, his comprehension of life. We read depictions of history, stories of imagination, and those that sought merely to control. We saw the hands of power, the owners of land, the patrons whose desire caused the creation of objects and edifices. We saw the adornments of man's body, those precious items of his desire, his rich ornamentation in worked metal and cut stone. We saw his palaces and temples, his great monuments built with the skill of artisans and the blood of slaves for the glory of power. We saw structures that were lost, palaces and temples of cultures long destroyed by obscurity and vengeful competitor. We saw the evolution of man's designs for war, weaponry, fortresses and siege engines, the evolution of winning strategy. We saw the link between war and creation, concentrations of wealth, victors' hoardings, their celebration in creation, and their inevitable fall. We watched the evolution and spread of trade and its link to war. We saw societies permeate others like a new dye that spreads through water. We saw cultures, obscure and long forgotten, the achievements of people long dead before others arrived to populate lands empty of all but ghosts. We saw their growth and their beliefs, their joys and their successes. We saw their sorrows, their strife, their life and destruction. Farmers' cottages, artisans' workshops, tools to work land, wood, stone, and metal. We saw the grains he grew and the beasts that plowed the soil. And we watched as nature retook what had been hers, leaving only traces of settlements, ruins of once busy habitations. Ancient walls of stone upon shores of wet wind-swept grasses witnessed by none but shrieking gulls and sea hounds of lonely coves. The pantomime spread before us, the long passage, the instinct to survive the fear of death by nature, replaced with fear of obscurity at the will of another man. A constant shifting of power, with fear used in support of the ruling few to marshal men against enemies, both real and imagined, conflict where otherwise could be peace. We recognized man's spirit for survival as his driving force. It was rooted in all men to keep wolf and storm at bay, necessary but too easily harnessed by others' greed. The fault was in the creation of man, in his failure to resist the power that would corrupt his desire to survive, in his inability to distinguish need. Man's world was of belief, of order by imposed structure, one that sought to understand a mystery that we could never know. We understood what man had sought. It swept around us, piercing our minds and bodies. Caught within that mystery, man guesses, craves, and abhors. We had known nothing to reject, with feet planted in mountains. We never thought to crave. As children of sky, we accepted our place. Ours was a way without mystery. It was a way of will, grounded in certainty. So in reading the works of man, whether of poetry or of science, we sought what it is to not know, to blindly search an unknown room. We comprehended through our learning the reason man struggled. He was given a space in which to interact. He was to create himself as he saw fit, but he was to do so from a basis of ignorance, so that he could draw himself from his mists into a greater lightness of knowing. But underlying all, two forces exist within manifestation, one that draws and one that opposes. Man had fallen victim too much to the latter, and his malign power had grown to threaten the world. Our Father, the spear-bearer, the oath-keeper, bringer of balance, was tasked to attend. He created me to be his body, with my companions as his limbs, and our beasts, natural to this world, his senses. We watched 100 winters pass from the mouths of our caves, from the peaks and valleys around. In summers all was green, but far enough north to know cold. In those caves we grew into men and women, living as we had in our prior home, exercising and training. The old man spoke little to us as a group. My companion's experience of him was mainly limited to our periods of meditation and martial training. During those periods he was silent, communicating by gesture of eye. With me, however, his voice was familiar. Each evening he would summon me to talk. We would climb a hidden stair to the cliff top, and looking out over an expanse of wilderness, he would speak to me of his task. He spoke of the need to heal the stray, to show mercy to the true, to use force only against that which was lost and could not be saved in this world. He spoke of the eye he had long kept over man, how he had sought to avoid my creation by instilling his objectives through sons and the influence of speech alone. But he had managed only to slow the rising of man's destructive power. Without stronger action, that rising force would crest. He had looked into the future and seen that man's current course, without corrective influence, would cast him down too far. Rarely, he told me, was action taken such as he took now with me. He was to act as much as possible through man. Eventually, it was time for me to leave. My companions remained until the old man led them to a horseshoe valley far in the west. The valley was within a land I would claim as payment for service to the realm of a king. There the old man would build a mighty fortress school for the children of our dream. From the crystal orbs each year, 1,200 children would be born. From the crystal orbs each year, 12 children would be born, and it was they who at the age of 6 would be delivered from the tutelage of silent masters. So, on noble Melior, and with Leolfer my shadow beside, I entered the world of man. Torunn, listening carefully, now knew from where her books had come. Her days at the cottage had been spent outside, but in the evenings she had read, and the source of her books was the couple. She said, "You asked my mother about those who gave me Mikkel and the books. I had forgotten their names. Even now they elude me." Leif stopped walking and turned to her. "Their names were Unner and Tormodr. Your mother never knew the meanings of their names, nor who they were. But now you know that they were siblings by my father, placed to protect and guide you and your mother. My companions represent different elements in my council, and those two whom you met represent love and mindfulness. I wondered when you first told me of your horse and your books as we sat at your cottage. I knew not of their presence when I stayed with you, only that my father's hand had entered your world. When you spoke of the couple, I knew it was through them he had done so. Will I see them again?" "You will see them again. They will be in the north. They await our return, once our time here has ended." Torunn took Leif's arm as they continued to walk, more slowly than before. Her womb had expanded almost to fullness with the presence of growing lives within her. All around, branches of trees were heavy with the nearly ripe fruit they bore. Her husband's voice rose again to finish the story it told. "Long I travelled unknown on the wings of death, watching talons pry living souls from the ground. Hardly rooted, risen to flight, withered, senseless and dry, in cold, breathless air to perish, crushed in the beak of unseen evil. Unhearing and blind, warnings were lost, insensitive to silenced pain, and thus carried within, unquestioned. Man trusted in his strength to defend against danger, to use against competitor, to resist and prevail. And as that strength grew, as competitors fell away, danger was stifled, but his instinct remained. It remained as a fundamental force of will, surging ever forward despite the conquering of resistance. Man had won his battle, became his own competitor, failed to realize that time required a shift of focus. Strength remained his bannermaster, allowing the growth of a life lost to its reason to be. Man's strength, as brutish as that of former enemies, was a lion to die on a wide, desolate prairie. Man's power would become as a great flood. Unlike nature, he lacked the wisdom to counter his power of destruction. This power had sustained man, guaranteed his survival. Now it was his own power that threatened him, and all else beside. Long I lived amongst man, serving his tastes, feeding his greed, rewarding with currency. There were 2 kings I called master in that time. The first's coffers I filled with gold, and for the second I seized land. Handsomely rewarded in kind, much I amassed of gold, but always of modest habit I never spent it. In northern caves, guarded by bats, in land I would claim, I hid a hoard of forgotten wealth. And handsomely rewarded in kind, I took land far and near, in the north, rock and mountain, in the south, hills and forest. In the mountain north, the valley of the horseshoe, frozen upland pastures, the deep caves of the bat. Wolf and bear and elk roamed that high wilderness of stone and frozen soil, coursed by crystal streams. In the southern hills, in forest, haunted and avoided, stood a king and a queen, each as ancient as thought. They held court in tangled ring of root and branch, a circle of stone and spring, protected and fed, a valley of untainted life. I had known what I sought, forgotten seats of hidden power, neglected and unknown, useless, forgotten to all but me. My wealth lay in darkness, never squandered, its missing value long unnoticed. And I, too, drifted away in the currents of time, one lost shadowy player in an everlasting struggle for power. I sought to understand man's power, so to harness that power, so to employ it in order to destroy it. I had achieved my task and was left with my kernel of reward, a single sliver of evil with which to forge a sword. Soon my wealth would touch the sweaty palms of greed once more, to fuel it, to drive it, to funnel it, and then break it. But before then I was to understand another aspect of man, his light that must remain, so that he is not lost completely. So threefold I was tasked, to seek what should live, to determine what would perish, and to assist the world beyond. They had arrived back at the pool, and Stigender said no more.